Everyone at the pump swore this would be the year gas got cheap again. And technically they were right, but almost nobody is talking about why the oil industry itself ended up hurting because of it. Here is the detail nobody is putting in a headline. In 2025, American oil producers pumped more crude than this country has ever pumped in its entire history. Something like 13.6 million barrels a day. That is not a typo, that is a record. And in that same year, oil prices crashed by more than 20% in the first 100 days of the new administration alone. So picture that for a second. The most oil ever produced on American soil, happening at the exact same time prices fell so low that many of the companies pulling it out of the ground were losing money on every single barrel. Record production, record pain. That is the paradox almost nobody explains, and that is what we are unpacking today. To understand how we got here, you have to go back to the promise. Donald Trump ran his campaign on what he called energy dominance. Drill more, permit faster, build more pipelines, open more federal land, sell more natural gas overseas, and cut the red tape that oil executives had been complaining about for years. On day one, according to Reuters reporting, he ordered the restart of liquefied natural gas export approvals that had been paused under the previous administration, and he pushed an agenda aimed squarely at boosting oil and gas output across the country. For a lot of people in the industry and a lot of investors watching from the sidelines, this sounded like the beginning of a boom. Less regulation plus faster permits plus more export capacity should equal a stronger, richer American oil sector. That is basic economic logic, and on paper it made sense. Oil executives welcomed it. Investors leaned into it. Analysts at major banks initially read the whole agenda as bullish for American supply. Politicians on one side called it energy dominance, and critics on the other side warned it would not really save anything, it would just shuffle costs and risks around. But for a moment, almost everyone agreed on one thing, which was that Washington was about to make life easier for the American oil industry. Here is the problem, and this is the line that should be tattooed on every energy analyst's desk. There is a massive difference between controlling American energy policy and controlling the global oil market. A president can change how fast a permit gets approved. A president can open up federal acreage. A president can order the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to release barrels during a crisis. What a president cannot do, no matter how favorable the domestic policy is single-handedly set the price of oil, because oil is not an American product, it is a global commodity, priced by forces that operate completely outside the Oval Office. So what actually moved the needle in 2025? A combination of forces that had almost nothing to do with domestic drilling policy and everything to do with global supply and demand. Start with OPEC+, the alliance of oil-producing nations led in large part by Saudi Arabia working alongside Russia. Reuters reported that OPEC+ kept adjusting its output throughout the year, including compensation cuts announced in March as part of a broader strategy to manage global supply. Then, later in the year, the group released something in the neighborhood of 2.9 million barrels per day back into the market, barrels that had previously been held off, before finally pausing further increases heading into the first quarter of 2026. Think about the scale of that decision for a second. That is not a policy tweak. That is a group of nations essentially deciding, together, how full or how empty the world's gas tank should be, and American drilling permits do not get a vote in that room. Then add the tariff war. Trump's broader trade agenda, which included the threat of secondary tariffs on countries buying Russian oil, according to Bloomberg reporting, injected a level of uncertainty into global markets that spooked forecasters everywhere. Reuters reported that the tariff uncertainty pushed major forecasting bodies, including the Energy Information Administration, the International Energy Agency, OPEC itself, and several major banks, to revise their oil demand growth expectations downward. When traders think the global economy is about to slow down because of a trade war, they assume fewer trucks on the road, fewer factories running, fewer flights in the air, and that means less oil being burned. Demand expectations fall, and prices fall right along with them. Now bring in China, the largest single engine of global oil demand growth for the last 2 decades. Trade friction between Washington and Beijing directly threatens Chinese economic growth, and slower Chinese growth means less Chinese oil consumption. That single relationship, thousands of miles away from any American drilling rig, can move the price of gasoline in a small town in Ohio more than any local energy policy ever could. By the spring of 2025, Bloomberg reported that the combination of tariffs and OPEC+ supply increases had pushed oil down by nearly a quarter from where it stood at the start of the administration. Reuters separately reported that benchmark American crude fell to around $60 a barrel, a level that sits below what many producers actually need just to break even. Read that again, below break even. That means a huge chunk of the American oil industry was pumping at a loss, even while total national output output hit an all-time high. How does that even happen? It happens because the Energy Information Administration confirmed that production kept climbing due to efficiency gains and better technology, even as drilling rig activity actually declined, because the economics of drilling new wells at those prices simply stopped making sense for a lot of operators. This is where we need to kill a few myths that most people still believe, because they are the reason this story feels so confusing on the surface. Myth number 1. The president controls the price of gasoline. False. A president can influence policy, sanctions, tariffs, and emergency reserve releases, but the price at the pump mainly reflects the global price of crude, refining costs, taxes, and distribution, most of which sit far outside any single administration's control. Myth number 2. More drilling automatically means more profit for oil companies. False, and 2025 is the textbook example. The Energy Information Administration confirmed that production rose even as rig counts fell, because lower prices can crush the profitability of new wells, no matter how much red tape gets cut in Washington. Myth number 3. Energy independence means immunity from global prices. Only partially true. Producing more oil domestically does reduce how dependent the country is on imports, but American consumers and American producers are still living inside the same global pricing system as everyone else. Independence does not mean isolation. Myth number 4. The United States controls the global oil market. False. America is a massive producer, arguably the largest in the world by volume, but oil is priced globally, and OPEC Plus, Russia, Saudi Arabia, Chinese demand, and financial conditions everywhere all factor into that price at the same time. So who actually came out ahead in all of this, and who got hurt? American oil producers had a mixed year. They benefited from a friendlier regulatory environment, faster permits, and reduced compliance costs, but many of them were squeezed hard by the lower price environment and responded by pulling back on new drilling. Production still rose nationally, but that was thanks to efficiency, not because companies were eager to drill more at unprofitable prices. Refiners had a more complicated story. Cheaper crude feedstock can help refining margins, but tariff-driven disruptions to supply chains added volatility and complexity that ate into some of those gains. Consumers, meaning regular drivers filling up their tanks, were probably the biggest quiet winners of the year because gasoline prices tend to track crude prices over time, and falling crude eventually shows up as relief at the pump, even if it takes a little while to trickle down. Exporters, especially in the liquefied natural gas space, had a genuinely strong year. Reuters reported that American liquefied natural gas exports hit a record above 100 million metric tons in 2025, meaning the export-focused side of the energy policy delivered exactly what it promised, even while the drilling side struggled with weak prices. Oil service companies, the businesses that supply equipment, labor, and infrastructure to drillers, had a rough stretch because when producers pull back on new wells, the service industry feels that pain almost immediately, regardless of how favorable federal policy might be on paper. So here is the question worth sitting with, and honestly worth arguing about in the comments below. If a president delivers almost everything the oil industry publicly asked for, lighter regulation, faster permits, more export capacity, and record-breaking national production, and prices still crash below break-even anyway, does that count as energy policy working? Or does it prove that energy policy was never really the thing in control to begin with? Because here is the honest answer this story keeps pointing back to. Policy can change the cost of compliance. Policy can change how quickly a permit gets approved. Policy can change how much federal land is open for development, how much export capacity exists, and how confident investors feel walking into a project. But policy cannot change what the rest of the planet decides to do. Global markets decide the benchmark price of oil. Global markets decide how much OPEC Plus chooses to supply. Global markets decide how fast demand grows or shrinks. Global markets decide whether a recession is coming, and global markets ultimately decide whether a new well is even worth drilling in the first place. That is why a genuinely pro-oil administration can exist in the very same year that oil company profits get squeezed, because those two outcomes are being decided by two completely different systems that only occasionally line up. In the end, the biggest surprise of 2025 was never really about whether Donald Trump's energy plan had limits. Every policy has limits. The real surprise, the one worth remembering the next time you fill up your tank, is realizing that even the largest economy on the planet has to play by rules it does not fully write, inside a market it does not fully control, sitting at a table with Saudi Arabia, Russia, and China, where the United States is powerful, but it is not the only power in the room. So next time gas prices swing one way or the other, and someone tells tells you it is all because of one policy or one president, you will know the real answer is bigger, messier, and honestly a lot more interesting than that. If you want to keep understanding what is actually steering the industry that puts fuel in your tank and shapes what sits in your garage 5 years from now, stick around because we are about to go a lot deeper into who really holds the wheel.